Welcome to Radio Omnicor. I'm your host Colleen McClintock, and you're listening to the show that is guaranteed to teach you something useful and introduce you to dynamic and interesting guests. Today's episode has a double treat in store. Not only do we have our multi-talented guest Michael Charton, but Muitheri Wahome, longtime friend of Omnicor and polymath, is standing in for Hilton as co-host. So let's start with Michael. He completed his articles and left to work in the USA in the field of mergers and acquisitions before returning to South Africa. He then worked as a financial director in the media and advertising industry. It was here that his evolution from accountant to storyteller was crystalized. He resigned from his job as financial director in order to realize a decade-old idea: to transform the complex history of South Africa through the medium of a story, My Father's Coat. In the process, he founded Inherit South Africa to reveal untold stories from the past for edutainment, understanding, and nation building. Michael literally climbs into the shoes of 5 protagonists: Mzilikazi, Kruger, Rhodes, Smuts, and Mandela, and tells their respective interlinked stories over a period of 200 years. The genius of his story is how over a period of 90 compelling minutes, he introduces each of these characters in a way that lures you under their spell as he seemingly embraces their beliefs and biases. Our co-host Muitheri is a financial services professional with a deep interest in the history and lure of the investment industry in South Africa. Her particular interest is in tracking the arc of history in order to be able to help facilitate the maturation of this transforming industry by being informed by the past. A perfect combination of co-host and guest. Great, so welcome Michael and Muitheri to the studio. It's very exciting to have both of you. And I think let's just kick off a little bit, Michael, with you telling us a bit about what's keeping you busy. I know you fly up all the time to do the shows and you've managed to squeeze in the podcast.
Yeah, so I mean, most of my life is my days are generally reading and catching up on a bit of admin. And then, I travel around South Africa, mainly between Joburg and Cape Town. And most nights I tell a story.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, so.
And Muitheri, what's keeping you busy? You've got lots of exciting things brewing.
So lately it's been trying to figure out how do you deal with publishers. I've been writing this story, and in a way I feel a lot of connection to Michael today, so I'm very excited to be here. So I've been writing a historic story, and now I'm at the point where I'm like, where are the publishers? How do you deal with them? So that's what I'm up to.
Oh, wow. So I do think that this is a wonderful connection and co-host and guest, because you're both obsessed with history. And Muitheri is probably your biggest fan and has introduced so many people to your show. One of the interesting statistics I saw was so many people returning to see your show. I think something up to 65% of people are actually coming back to see your show. Is that part of your marketing campaign, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's hard to tell from my side, but the one thing for sure is that I do cover a lot of ground in sort of 100 minutes. So there's a lot of facts which I'm putting across. Right. And I think a lot of people take something out of the story, but also realize that they want to hear it again because there are parts that they know they didn't quite grasp. And to me, having written the story, I know that it's quite nuanced. I spend a lot of time creating some undercurrents and little themes within themes. And I also acknowledge that people aren't going to pick them up first time around. And I think the sort of feedback has been people who have watched it a second, even a third or whatever times, they do seem to get something else out on each occasion, which, I like. But if I could write it well enough, hopefully people only need to see it once. But
Well, I think what you're saying is just it's like an immersive experience. Maybe tell us a little bit about what brought you to even come up with this format, because it's kind of edutainment. It's a very unusual approach.
It is a long story. So I'm sure answering this will be broken up into a few parts. But broadly, I wanted to try and find a way to make South African history more accessible. So how I got to that point is it's all long story, but I believe that there's great power in the South African story, and Unfortunately, South African history, for whatever reason, isn't, I believe, particularly well understood, regardless of education levels. Many South Africans, considering just how pervasive our past is to our current policies and what we know our future is going to be, one would think, instinct tells you that South Africans would have been very curious about it and would have a very strong understanding of our past and would be debating it daily. Yes, we debate politics daily, but I don't think we don't debate our past. We don't have a huge understanding of our past, which in turn, in my opinion, means we don't have a great consensus in our past. And I think without a great consensus of our past, it's very difficult to really, truly build what we could call a nation. And that's, I'm just scratching a tiny surface of a surface, but I guess that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to inspire a little bit of curiosity among South Africans and about our past, and perhaps to look at a story which they've heard parts of and from various angles, to try and maybe give them a slightly fresher view of what has happened here.
So one of the things I find most inspiring about you was your capacity to reinvent yourself. You studied accounting, worked in the industry for a while, and then at some point in your life you decide you want to be a storyteller. How does that work? So at university my brain started working over time, like I think many young people's do. I signed up to study accounting. I have two brothers, they're both accountants. My grandfather's an accountant.
Wow.
And it's sort of a family tradition that I was going to study accounting. I didn't have any pull towards accounting. Academically I'd been solid, but not overwhelming. And so I studied a BCom and then eventually was, from quite early on, had the intention of becoming a chartered accountant. I think probably strategically from a life perspective, it was quite defensive that I knew it would give me something which I could earn money out of and maybe having a meaningful career. But things don't always go according to plan. And it was in my first year, I remember it very clearly. But I read a few books, one in particular, an Alan Paton novel, "Cry the Beloved Country," and I remember reading that book, and it was kind of a sort of a very pivotal moment for me. And I realized I'd never actually contemplated what South Africa's past had meant for people on the ground. And obviously it's a novel, it's fiction, but for a moment I found myself in Natal and just for putting my heart into history, whereby suddenly I could feel the sort of pain and the frustrations of what it must have felt like, for most South Africans, the sort of system that was in play. And it had quite a big impact on me, because here I was, I would have been 20 years old or there and thereabouts, and I'd lived my whole life thinking South Africa was, that my life was quite normal. And then for all of a sudden you could look back and your life has been very different to normal. We live in a strange society. And
that bubble was burst in a way
exactly.
You read that.
And from that moment really I'd studied history from a trick with no emotion. I mean, they found a way amazingly really to pull emotion out of the story. And suddenly I had the emotion. As a 20-year-old, of course, you don't need much encouragement to get emotion in your life. And from there, it's been a long process, which really got me in 2015 to resign. And I mean, the steps along the way there are quite a few steps, but after I finished articles, 2004, I suddenly found myself with time, which I hadn't had for a long time, because during articles, I was working, and then we also had to study for board exams and all sorts of things. The studies never really stopped. And then suddenly, end of 2004, I realized I was going to have some time on my hands, or I thought I would. I went off to the United States and did a couple of years' work there. But as I said, for the first time, I wasn't studying since sub A. And so I picked up history through UNISA.
Oh, wow.
Quite an amazing thing, really, that I could sit in Pennsylvania, I could sit in Philadelphia, UPenn, and sit with an invigilator. I mean, I paid I can't even remember, it was about 1,500 Rand per subject per year or what. It was an amazing offering. And so I studied that for a few years, never really with the intention of getting a degree, but just because now I wanted to try and focus my curiosity. I'd realized I didn't understand South Africa's past. If I was blatantly honest, I knew parts of the South African story, but I still couldn't understand it. If I was honest, that was it. I didn't understand it, and I wanted to try and understand it better. So having studied that, I then returned back to South Africa. Of course, my financial career had to continue because I had to try and make some money. And then I returned back to Cape Town with the idea of studying history full-time for 6 more months, and then, telling myself, okay, well, you've now scratched that, and now that you're going to start being serious about life and getting a big job. And so I came back to Cape Town and spent 6 months here studying, and then, yes, again, by hook or by crook, these strange things happen in life. But someone said they were looking for a maths teacher at a school called COSAT in Khayelitsha. And I spent a term and a half, I can't remember, maybe 3 or 4 months studying, teaching standard 9 maths there, which, it was just a great life experience. Just a few times a week going out, preparing these little these lectures and speaking to this wide-eyed class who was so excited about life and what it had to offer. And I remember standing there going, geez, these youngsters here, they were, a sharp bunch. That's actually a fantastic story, that school. And I thought, these guys, half the, we'd talk for about 5 or 10 minutes each class about what, how exciting life can be. If you can just get through this year, next year, and a few years at university, this life is going to open up for you like you cannot believe. And I remember just having these chats to these guys and feeling quite inspired about South Africa. And so the decision which I'd originally had of moving on to London, where most of my friends were, it just sort of came to a grinding halt, and I picked up a job in Cape Town. The idea that now I was sucked into the South African story. And again, all the while I continued to read South African history, even after I'd sort of finished studying it, and the modules I continued to read. In fact, that's what I still do. And through this process, again, in time, I came to realize that there was a massive gap in South Africa around the dinner table, around the braai, about what South Africans knew about the past. And people in this country have wonderfully strong opinions on politics and economics, and yet if you probe them about how those came to be, what are the context, what was the foundation of those opinions, their understanding of the past wasn't strong at all. And so I guess saw this little gap, and that gap was what sort of inspired what has subsequently become the purpose of my company, which is, as I mentioned earlier, to make South African history more accessible. And that was the gap which I then pondered for close to 10 years. How are we going to close this gap? And it's not easy, because South Africans, like any peoples, are not inclined to pick up a 750-page book called A History of South Africa. We don't have the time. We're busy. Our lives are just, like most of us, are just waking up and trying to survive. So there's a lot of barriers between wanting to understand the story, even knowing that you should understand it, and actually getting there. And so that was what I tried to close down. And I then sort of various little steps happened along the way. I went to go and listen to David Rattray at Fugitive's Drift, the story of Isantluana and Rorke's Drift. And I found that really quite a moving life experience. Having arrived, knowing very little, for example, about the Zulu people. I knew who they were. I'd heard about Shaka, like so many South Africans. And 2 days later, I walked away thinking to myself, what an amazing group of people, what an amazing culture. And I thought to myself then, as part of the sort of steps to resolving this puzzle of making it more accessible, was, geez, imagine South Africans could have this kind of curiosity, this interest in all the various groups and in one another. And I thought, this sort of a upward spiral, if we could get to that point where people knew enough about each other's cultures that you were curious about it, you weren't sort of afraid of it or standoffish. So that was one of the big stepping points. And then some really strange little things happened, but I'll try and rush over it relatively quickly. But I was in advertising, and one of our big clients, a big short-term insurer, looked like they were about to leave. So our head of client service came back to the agency one day and said, well, it's over. These guys are leaving us. And anyway, so it was a massive client. We were going to have to retrench. And so we sat around the table, probably 5 or 6 or 7 of us. I remember it was called Project Sunshine. I have no idea why, but and we were going to try and resolve this problem. And at that point, I sort of stuck my hand up as the financial guy and said, look, I can't do a whole heap here. I'm not really that client facing, but the one thing I can do is to try and make sure that my strategists and my creative team have a good understanding of short-term insurance, that they at least understand the fundamentals and the various models and how they work and why. I believed our client at the time had a very good model. So I put a training module together, which in turn gained some traction, and then in turn gained traction within our client. And I ended up speaking for them and doing some training and induction days for them for a couple of years. And I remember doing that, talking about short-term insurance. My instinct had always been to create stories out of it. So I used stories from South Africa's history as a way to try and get these subtle points across. Of course, I wrote that initially because I knew the people I was writing the training module for were creative and strategists, so smart people, but not always like mathematically smart. And putting a document with a heavy coloured graph would probably not have been the right way to approach it. So it was my instinct to write it that way. And I remember seeing this with these, again, wide eyes, and I guess something was slowly dawning in me that I could tell a story if I applied my mind to it. And then another story popped onto my radar, again, very random, about a story about the 1937 Springboks, which sounds like it is a laughably obscure story, but it's a beautiful human story, and I've told that close to 100 times now, and I love it. It is a great story. And that was just for a bunch of mates initially, and then got into sort of a corporate world. And then, but this is now sort of 2015, and I was in a business which was then, we were selling. And that was really my, it was like so many things in life, it was luck. The timing was great, and I was involved in that deal, and I was able to walk away with just enough, unfortunately nothing mind-blowing, but enough to buy myself some time. And that was, again, what I've been fighting for many years, the time to invest in trying to make South Africa's history accessible. And by that stage, I'd had this idea of, combining elements of what I'd learned from the storytelling at Isandlwana, and all these other elements in my life had come together, that I had a broad idea of what I wanted to do, which was to tell a story which you could listen to in a single sitting, and which you would walk away from having a better understanding of South Africa's complexities, and hopefully with that pushing you over that little hill which moves you into the space of being curious rather than scared of our past, or pain or guilt or whatever those emotions we normally feel about our past.
Listening to you, I sense that there have been so many ways that storytelling has impacted your life, whether it's connecting you to youngsters as you taught them maths, whether it's connecting to creatives at the workplace who need to somehow figure out a client. And it just shows the impact of storytelling in such a beautiful way. So besides that kind of thing, how has that storytelling impacted your life? Are there more connections that you now have with people that are fairly disparate and not just accountants? And or what? How has this changed your life?
Yeah, I mean, again, like storytelling for me was just this. Growing up was for children, right? And it has been an amazing shift in life to be involved in the industry or the world of storytelling. It's something I'm much more conscious of now. I mean, to the point I've actually, about 2 months ago, sat down, just inspired one evening, and I wrote 5 or 6 pages about what it meant to tell a story. What is the difference? What is a story compared to a lecture or, most of the sort of non-fiction books that I read? And so I'm very aware of what storytelling is, what it's done.
So what are some of those things that you wrote? What 2 or 3 things define a story?
Yeah, look, I think firstly is there's a human side to it. So stories are about people. I mean, in children's books, they're often hippopotamus or elephants or whatever they might be, but in reality, it's all people. So my instinct has always been in telling a story is to climb into the shoes of the characters that I'm playing around with, and to, for a moment, allow my audiences to experience what it's like to have been in their shoes. So I don't focus so much on what date they were born, or where they fitted in the timeline, or what their, but I want my audiences to feel what it's like to have been that person. So I spend time introducing them as children. I need to find ways which you can empathize in people who we ordinarily would find it very difficult to empathize with. So that human side is important. The other important element, which I think the comedians do very well, the great storytellers really, but is that there needs to be an honesty in it. So there needs to be a truth. And that truth needs to be something which is known to you as the audience, but perhaps not articulated like that before, which is what often comedians just do. And when they're penny drop moments, that's when you can't help yourself but bursting into laughter. And storytellers, obviously my stuff's generally a lot more serious than that, but I'm trying to do the same thing. I'll often introduce you to 2 concepts and then at some point subtly link them together, and then at some point, depending on how much you already knew or how attentive you've been, the penny will drop for you, and you'll hopefully get some conscious or unconscious adrenaline pumping through your body, just to like, oh geez, I'd never thought about it like that before. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain honesty in it, and the combination of those two things, ideally what it does is it, as a person listening to a story, you're no longer present. So if you're sitting in your lecture hall at UCT and working your way through concepts, you're very aware that you're sitting in that lecture hall and Leslie, and you're listening to that lecture. You always you know exactly where you are. You sort of maybe pass a note across to your mate saying, what is do you understand this part? But you're very aware. Your brain's working very hard, but you're there. You're present. But in storytelling, if you're getting it right, I think for a moment you're actually no longer sitting in Leslie. You are transported, because the language that is being used, the flow, is all very important. It's dragging you into a different world. And so for a moment you're not sitting there, and you are somewhere else, and to me that sort of allows our brains to work in a different space. It allows your different parts of your brain on the sort of on the scan would be lighting up. And I think those are parts of the brain which allow us to understand things sometimes better. Those parts where you get emotion working, it allows you to grasp things. So yeah, it's sort of, I guess those are some of the key things that came out. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. I know we'll be touching on this a little bit later, but I can't help but wonder whether that's an instinct or it's something that you learn.
The reality is, the storytelling. I wrote the story out of instinct, and I have subsequently gone back and tried to dissect it, and I think instinct is probably, for me, it feels like it's what it has been. But I think, the reality as humans, we're learning these storytelling skills from a very young age, whether we actually apply them ourselves and tell stories or just listen. But we understand storytelling, and because that's sort of what humans have done. That's the only way the only way we've transferred knowledge and culture and insight. If you had to put humans onto a timeline, just the tiny little fraction, a little sliver on the one end would be when we've transferred information by writing it and passing it on through generations. Before that, so many generations have been driven by people learning to tell stories as ways to drive a broader culture. And so our bodies are well developed and well adapted to both telling and absorbing stories. And I think that's, there's no science for that behind me. That's just my sort of observation of how humans have developed. But so when I say it's instinct, it is instinct, but it's also something we have been learning fairly consciously since we say 2 years old, and watching, because we spend most of our day looking at people and thinking, analyzing generally subconsciously, admittedly, but what is the person I'm talking to thinking? What are they? And so our brains are seriously they fit.
I think you can speak about instinct, but in your case it seems to be your purpose that drives you. And I think it's a good opportunity to just tell the listeners a little bit more about your show, because it's so unusual in the way it's kind of a monologue. You're kind of an actor, maybe for people coming to watch, what would they expect?
So it's a lot of people say to me, I don't know what to call it. Is it a show or a performance or a talk? And so an actor would stand on the stage, and there effectively is a glass wall between you and the actors and actresses, where the only time they do acknowledge you is sort of subconsciously. They give you the 1,000-yard stare. But for the most part, the whole point of a play would be to be interacting with the other actors and actresses on the stage. So mine is different in that I am myself, and there is no glass wall between me and the audience. So I am telling a story, but it's not a talk in the classic sense of what we understand a talk to be, which is someone working through a set of pieces of information and context. Mine is a carefully crafted story. I never turn it the same any 2 nights, because I don't know, something between my brain's not good enough. And also you get pulled into the emotion on the evening, whatever that theatre's giving you that day, you often, it sort of reflects maybe in how you give it out. But so it's a real performance that I am just a human being standing in front of another group of human beings telling a story. And I think people, funny enough, I think that's been one of the strong points, that people realize that it's a very rare genre actually, that people stand up, and it's not a play, but it's also not a talk where it's pulled together by an academic or something. I pull you into the story like a play might, but I'm trying to pass knowledge on as a talk might. So and I think that's been some power. Like I'm able to get real eye contact with people in the audience, and if I can see someone's engaged, I'll push back eye contact at them consciously, because it creates a sort of tension in the room. So it is a story. To go back to your broader question, the story you guys saw the other night was My Father's Coat, and so what I try to do there broadly is to take the lessons I'd learned from the battlefields, and to try and apply it to a much bigger story. So to give you context on that, I sat back and I listened to Rattray, and I was, to my earlier point about storytelling, I was transported back to Zululand in 1879. That story was so beautifully told, and I think that's what drives my still to this day. This is now 13 years later or 14 years later.
Is that how long your show has been going on?
No, that's when I heard this David Rattray telling the story at Rorke's Drift. And so I still have this emotional link to it. And I see anything on social media about the Zulu people or anything about Rorke's Drift or Isan Tluana, I'd read that article because I have an emotional attachment to it. So, but the benefit that they have, the guys telling stories on the battlefields, is they have a very narrow story. So they're telling a story about Rorke's Drift for, called it an hour. And they can delve into the characters in this battle. They can talk about the Williamses and the Joneses, and they've got enough time to describe the creases under their eyes and whatever it might be. So they have this great balance where they can really pull you into the story, all those storytelling techniques, because they've got these characters who they've got time to invest in. And I thought, well, my challenge now in telling a bigger story, so My Father's Coat aims to pull some of the key dynamics of the greater South African story together, and to, through that, I guess, pull a framework of understanding together. But so my challenge with that is it's a far bigger story. And with a similar amount of time, how then do you still use those storytelling techniques? How do you invest time in characters enough that you don't just give each character 20 seconds and move on to the next? And so my approach was to try and look for characters through whom I thought I could tell a bigger story. So I chose 5 core characters, although there are supporting actors and actresses. What I found through that is I could find myself on various sides of the story, and it also allowed me to reduce the number of characters to the point where I could invest time building empathy in characters who, again, as I mentioned, several of whom most people wouldn't ordinarily find empathy with. And so that has been the approach. It's quite a long story. I mean, it's 100 minutes. People tell me it feels like it's not that long, but I cover a fair amount of ground in that 100 minutes, as you would need to. And every time I did pull something out in the preparation phase, I felt like I was ripping a limb off. It's very difficult to leave certain things out, and certain things I actually can't leave out because the story becomes compromised and therefore controversial. So I need to balance it on all sorts of sides to make sure the story pieces together. And those characters that I found worked well for me, but importantly, those 5 characters overlapped. So I wanted the authenticity of having 5 characters who engaged with one another, one way or another. Some of them a little bit tenuous, some of them strong. But again, that talks to that how humans respond. I mean, we really are good at watching other people interact and analyzing it. So for me to tell a story by having 2 characters who I've introduced you to from different backgrounds, and then to see them interact, I think humans respond well to that, and it draws them into the story. And also the beauty of it is having 5 characters over around about 200 years is that, for me anyway, it really opens up the timing. So growing up at school and learning about 1945, the end of World War II, it seemed like a hell of a long time ago. And it didn't really mean that much. It's just a number, it's a date. My grandparents were there. But putting into generations, one can feel how close these things actually are. I mean, the older I've got, the closer 1945 feels, in a strange kind of way. And so that it allows South Africans to get a better feel for how these timings happened. So we have these famous names in South Africa: Mzilikazi, Kruger, Rhodes, Smuts, Mandela. But for most people, many people can't place them. I used to do a dipstick when I was creating the story and say, who's older, Kruger, Rhodes, or Smuts? And most South Africans would sort of say, I've got no idea. How would I know that? And now we're talking from the Great Trek to the Second World War. There's a big gap. So I think it's helped people get a feel for just how the South African tragedy unfolded. Relative how quickly really it unfolded, from the discovery of minerals in particular.
So your show is called My Father's Coat. How did you come up with that title, and what's the significance of that title?
So I sort of worked it backwards in a sense, in that in Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela's autobiography, I stumbled upon this little section which hit home for me in a sense, but he was by this stage on Robben Island, and his son Tembi had been killed in a motorcycle accident in 1969, and he had been denied, having requested it, if I remember correctly, he was denied the opportunity to bury his boy, as would be his tradition, and he lay in his cell, and he was obviously a broken man, and as he lay in his cell stewing, the memory that flashed through his mind was arriving home late at night as a young freedom fighter, and he would often find Tembi asleep on the couch, draped in one of his old coats, and I think it's sort of soaking in, I guess, what comfort he could from his father, who by that stage was relatively distant. He was coming in at strange hours. He was really in the midst of the struggle, and I just liked the concept that he was a young man who was sort of consciously taking guidance and direction and comfort from his father by putting on his coat, and maybe the smell and the warmth and whatever it might be, soaking in that comfort. It was like one of those images which really stuck with me, and it just played on my mind for a while. But also, having written the story, I wrote the story without a title. So initially I knew what I wanted to do, but it had no title. I had to kind of think about that. And sort of as I was piecing the story together and finalizing it, I realized that really the theme of my story was that the way that people in this country think about our past and our current is, for the most part, so closely linked to the people closest to us, to the community, our opinions on the past, our opinions on the current. And so, what I did was make sure that these biases were prevalent. And I almost, again, did this instinctively as part of the storytelling process. But, Paul Kruger, for example, was only ever going to think about the world in one particular way. He only read one book his whole life, the Bible. And, he was a member of a very conservative church. The church was everything to him. And so he had a very defined way of looking at the world. And as I looked at all my characters, this is the case for all of them. And so for me, that's just such an amazing concept in South Africa, that you could have, that these people came in, we have sort of people from all over the world congregating, and in this beautiful part of the world, which was then set on fire by the discovery of minerals, and then how these all played out. And I guess what I realized was that one of the key points I'm trying to get across is that our views in the world, as rational as they seem, and more often than we care to admit, are very often not actually our own, that they are shaped instead by the people closest to us, and often for my characters, their fathers. And I think it's just an important theme for me within the greater story. And in terms of, if you really do want to understand the South African story, there is no middle ground. It's not like there's no middle. It's a bunch of biases on all sides of the middle, and the answer's in there somewhere. We'll never be able to put our finger on it, but understanding the biases involved is a huge step forward in trying to understand the complexities of South Africa's past.
So Michael, you told us a number of things about how you come up with a story, including the overlapping timelines of the 5 individuals on whom the story rests and with whom you move the story along. I have to say, the one connection you made that completely surprised me when I first listened to your wonderful presentation was the one about Nelson Mandela at Fort Hare and Jan Smuts coming to talk to young students when he was at Fort Hare. Now that floored me. How did you find that out in the first place? But that was such an amazing connection, given the 2 individuals in the history of South Africa and the role that they play of bringing people together or being global leaders.
Yeah, so I was looking for those connections because, as I said, for me that authenticity was important. And so often people will tell me, have I read this book or that? And it's a difficult position because I started for a long time, or for a while, I started reading via the index. And it's not the most healthy way to read, but I did a lot of, looking, I'd have, I've got a reasonably solid library which I've accumulated over time. And I've read a lot of chapters, and I'd love to read more books, but I went through a process of, as part of this, developing the story, of either rereading parts of books or not reading books, but reading parts of books. And I would look for those connections. So if I was reading a book about Kruger, I would either read it, or I would go to the index and look for things about Smuts or Rhodes, and all of a sudden you find your little connections between these human beings. So there's a little bit of a cheat that I did, but that particular one I actually did I picked up in Mandela's autobiography. So I did, that was, he spoke about being, at the university, and that Smuts was going to speak. If I remember correctly, he sort of also mentions that he was an Anglophile, whether it was that part of the book or not. But he sort of grew up, in a sense, believing, I guess, that the English were a force for good. And perhaps that they were the lesser of the enemy compared to where the Afrikaner people were heading towards. And so I just picked that up, and that he was very eager to hear Smuts speak. In fact, in the early versions of that story, it's been a great learning experience for me. I'd interpreted what Mandela had said in his autobiography to say, that he had great reverence for Jan Smuts. And I think I incorrectly used the word hero, because I wanted to later on in the story emphasize that Smuts was no longer his hero after he had moved to Johannesburg and sort of got a greater understanding of the political context. And that was one of the things I was called out on. And I get some constructive feedback from time to time, but for the most part it's been very useful, and over time I've been able to close a few gaps. But so I've reworded it and reread that chapter, and to be fair, the guy who called me out was right. And hero is not the right word, but he certainly had a real interest in Smuts. I guess he would, because he was at that stage a very high-profile international leader, and was very eager to hear him speak. And so he heard that speech, and that university, interestingly, gave him a rousing applause. Smuts at the time, the context there was that the late 1930s, 1939, and Afrikaner nationalism really had hit fever pitch. 1938 was the great Eeuwfeest, the centenary festival of the Great Trek, and Afrikaner people were coming together very, very strongly. And with all the I guess inevitable hatred that had been built in off the back of the concentration camps a generation and a half before, there was a lot of Afrikaner people were naturally, I guess, disinclined to want to go and fight this international war with the British, their old enemies, who'd treated them quite badly. And so Smuts was doing a roadshow around the country, trying to build up support for the British and the Allied forces. And one of those speeches was Fort Hare in 1939, and Mandela was in his only year at Fort Hare in that year, and that was the sort of connection I found. It was for me a little bit of a eureka moment, because I wanted that little connection, and those were obviously two important characters to me.
No, that for me, it's stuck in my head because I thought it was so fascinating. But now, so you're at this point where you've resigned from your job. You have to write the story. So how did you go about writing this story? Had you done a writing course? How did you just sit down and start writing? And then how is the story good enough to then use to tell it, in front of a crowd?
Yeah, so I have not done any formal writing courses. But I've always enjoyed writing, and I've sort of taken a certain amount of pride in everything I write, even right down to the most simplest of emails. But for me, I just believe. Look, I didn't know whether the story was going to work. So that's the one thing. I had the conversation with my wife. So I've now resigned. I've taken a little lump sum out, and then my wife and I look at each other and go, okay, well, what are we going to do now? We've got a couple of choices. Either I go and get another job, and I put this money into the bond, which is what I probably should have done. Or I, take a chance on this idea that I've had for a long time, which my wife and I have obviously spoken about many times. And
so was she worried?
She must have been. But to be fair, even my wife, she has an unbelievable, I mean that literally unbelievable, belief in my ability, and it's been a big help for me, I have to say. So right from the moment I resigned, and I'd find myself at a dinner table, and someone would say, "Well, Charts, what are you going to do now that you've resigned?" And I'd tell them my great idea. And I think a lot of people put on a very brave face. In fact, I know that because people 2 years down the line told me, "I just want to tell you, when you told me about your new idea, I was like, this is going to be a complete failure." So people put on a brave face. Some people openly told me they didn't think it was going to work, or there would be no way to make a living. But I also believed that worst case scenario, it would allow me to spend 18 months investing in learning about the country, which I still had this urge to learn more about. So I thought, worst case scenario, I'll do this for a year or 18 months, and if it doesn't work, I'll head back to the corporate world. So there was a certain amount of sort of accounting, rational play here. So then I sat down, and I finished end of June. I remember it so very clearly, a farewell party, and then I headed off for 2 weeks just to take a time out. July school holidays, we went up to the bush. And
so do you have children at this point in time?
Yeah, so look, every time I make a big career decision, I have a child at the same time. So I've got 3 children. I think my youngest was born in 20, so my wife was pregnant.
Oh.
So again, so awesome time to take a chance. So anyway, we went up to the bush and spent about 2 weeks up there, and I really just didn't do too much, but thought about what I was going to try and do next. And before I knew it, I was sitting back at my desk at home, and with a blank canvas in front of me. And I remember, it's quite a real moment when you go, okay, well, now I'm going to start writing this story. It's a 10-year-old idea. Please let me get this right, because I've told everyone I can do this. So then I sat down. I honestly thought, and also what I thought, the other sort of side part of that was, I thought tourism could keep me going in the interim as well. Mm-hmm. So I thought, no one really offers this to tourists, the idea that you could tell South African story well and get an emotional attachment to the country. So I thought the idea then was, by that summer, so I was starting halfway through July, I thought by December I'll at least have the tourism side up and running. And then the South African stuff will be a slightly deeper, bigger story, and we'll get to that in due course. About 18 months later, I was closing in on my first draft of anything. Mm-hmm. And I was starting to panic. Well, in fact, I know I panicked because in September, so 2015, June was my last month of work. In September 2016, I found a file recently where it was my CV being sent back out to the market.
Oh, wow.
Where I was running out of runway. And I obviously have these little young children, and I panicked basically. I thought, no, I've got to get a job. I'm going to run out I've only got a few months left here. Mm. So I put my CV out to the market, thankfully nothing but. And then just at that time, I had a couple gigs which just popped up, and those went, just so much better than I could ever have imagined.
And were they storytelling about the history of South Africa?
It was the first tellings of my father's coat. In retrospect, they were still very raw, but I guess people came in with. I think, like all things in life, there's an expectancy, and if you are better than what people expected, they walk out overwhelmed and joyful. And I don't think there was any expectations going to the first few gigs I did, and perhaps there was people who got more than they thought. But anyway, there was an overwhelming response to it, and I have this sort of also a very clear memory in my head of getting home the one night. I'd been so ecstatic at the response that I'd ended up going out for a drink with one of the people in the audience, and I was like so relieved, I guess, that people had responded as well as they had, better than I could have dreamed. And I got home at sort of midnight that night, and I woke up my wife Lolo, and I said, "Geez, you won't believe it, but I think we've got a story. I think we've got something here. This could work." And we spoke. I mean, we were wide awake. We spoke for a long time, and there was mass excitement in my life. And then maybe at that stage I was doing 1 gig a month, and then from probably, I think it was about March. It was March 2017. I did one particular gig where there were enough people who really liked it, and from that moment the sort of phone started ringing, and so that's when it picked up. But funny enough, there was a moment I remember taking heart out of. I think my CV was now in the market, my bank balance was looking a bit scroll, and I listened to a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, and it was a story of Leonard Cohen and his writing of the song Hallelujah. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful song, a great sound. And if you listen to the words, they're very deep. But this song nearly killed Leonard Cohen, according to this podcast, in that it took him 5 years to write that song. He wrote about 80 odd verses. I think there were only 5 in the final song. I might get the wording slightly wrong here, but at one point they discovered Leonard Cohen lying in the bathroom, stark naked in a hotel, banging his head against the floor, because this song had driven him to the point of dementia, basically. And I listened to this thing. I sort of remember also running out saying, Laura, you must listen to this. This is how, sort of, just so you know, if I'm a bit cranky, this is how I'm feeling, you know. And I had so many things in my head, so many pieces of paper in my office, stuck on the wall, stuck on my desk, little yellowies flicking out of every book. You know, I found myself a little bit overwhelmed at times. But then slowly, I guess as confidence builds, slowly the yellowies start coming off the book, and you can pull certain pieces of paper off the wall, and the story started coming together for me. And I sensed there could be something there, which was only really confirmed for me on those first few presentations. But it was a very, for someone who's not a writer with no real experience of it, I was jumping into the deep end in retrospect. I had the confidence of a dreamer, and then I guess I was cut down to a certain extent, but it was one of those things I'm proud of, that it took me a long time, but I got through it.
So we shouldn't forget to dream, and and persistence, and all these wonderful things that most of us, when you're thinking of reinvention, it's so good to hear you say that it's a struggle, but keep your eye on the prize. Yeah,
no, it's absolutely, keep your eye on the prize. Grit, determination, and bank balance. You've got to watch those things all quite carefully. And then luck. I can't help thinking that, as I look back at my story and those little touch points that I mentioned from the insurance company, from strange old rugby story, from listening to David Rattray, these little touch points, which in retrospect were just sort of forming this puzzle. But in respect, considering I've built a life which I really do love now, and I feel like I've got great purpose and a certain amount of freedom to use my brain as I like. I have to acknowledge that along the way there was, significant elements of luck which pushed me in a direction which has landed me here.
So Michael, you know how you speak about listening to David's rendition. How does it land for you when you hear people feel that way about your stories? Have you thought about that?
Look, funny enough, I don't hear a lot of it. If I'm honest, I get occasional emails, and I get some very nice feedback through that. But I guess I don't hear the third parties talking about it, if they are. So I don't think about it that much. I do really appreciate the feedback I get. If it's the feedback that I'm not saying whether it's positive or negative, that's less relevant. But I love it when I hear people saying it's really made them think slightly differently about the world, or it's made them more curious, or I've just bought this book as a result of your story. That kind of stuff really, I do find great meaning in it, even though it's just one person. But so I don't hear a lot of the stuff which, if there is stuff happening on the side, but so it's not something top of mind for me. But I guess that is why I'm doing it. So when I do hear people tell me that it was meaningful or moving, or it's changed their thought on something, I guess that's a big part of why I do what I do.
Well, I've been watching your Friday morning stories, and I think what you're really good at doing is getting the emotion and all the curious new information that you're learning, but they're very moving, the stories that you tell, and it's hard to forget them, which I think is a real talent and an art. So
I think it's links to those elements of storytelling, those two key elements, that one where it's got to be about a human being, and it's got to be a truth in it, a truth maybe which you haven't either known or hadn't thought about in that way before. We do take so much of the world for granted as being normal, because that's what we live in, so it has to be normal. But it's just a very simple thing, really, storytelling, in that you just conveying a certain truth which hasn't been seen before in that way.
I also think you make it look so effortless. So you keep alluding to the fact, well, there needs to be a human, there needs to be a truth, but the bottom line is that you behind authoring those stories, presenting them. I can imagine just those videos that you made must have taken hours and hours of work and creativity and thought, and so I hope you acknowledge yourself.
I think that's a part. If you think back to the comedians as well, they stand out on that stage. And it sounds to the audience as if they are off the cuff. that they've just arrived at the dinner table or the braai, and this is how they would behave either way. It doesn't matter if there's 700 people in front of them or not. But I'd be surprised if there aren't many comedians who tell you how well they've prepped for that and how many years it's taken to build confidence, and their stories may veer off in different directions. In fact, I'm sure they do because of different responses they get from their audiences, but I'm pretty sure they'll also tell you that it's taken years of preparation to make it look
effortless.
Like if there's no preparation.
So are you the life in the party at the braai?
No, you see, I mean, this is the, I'm not. I'm generally relatively quiet. I have quite a noisy family, and I can't compete with most of them. But yeah, I'm not. I've always been quite a hard thinker, and yeah, that's where I get my energies from. Quiet moments and thinking and observing, and that's really what I've always learned from in life. And yeah, so I'm definitely not a loudmouth. Look, if you ply me with enough beer,
loosen up.
I can loosen up a little bit, yeah. But I'm not. Instinctively, I'm not a loud person. Yeah.
Also, that's your job. So I know even in the work we do in coaching and leadership, you're so tired by the time you get home, or you're socializing. You're just very happy to be the one listening.
Yeah, no, I love going to the theatre now. I mean, we've got a new lease in life in the theatre because I suddenly love watching other people.
Right.
And now it's I learn.
Yes.
It's tax deductible. And, yeah.
Now, I know we're running out of time, but from a leadership point of view, of your 5 protagonists, what leadership lessons did you learn? I mean, what are the standout leadership lessons?
Yeah, so look, my leaders my characters are. It's worth noting that my characters are not great men in the broader sense of the word. They were leaders in the time, and certainly, some of the people who I talk about don't come out particularly well in my story for good reason. But the thing that they have in common, I think, is that they held a great presence. And that presence, I think, comes from having a purpose, but more than that, I would say, is that there was an authenticity about it. So, as I mentioned earlier, Kruger's a great example here of someone we have a very different way of looking at the world as to what he did. But he had a very direct purpose in life. He knew what he stood for and which people he was representing. And with that, he had a great confidence. So he didn't have to think too hard about the world. He wasn't, in a sense that he was being dragged in different directions, like, current president of South Africa. You can imagine the directions that he's being pulled in. He was, leading a sort of a nation in a sense, which was, by today's standards, relatively united. So he could go in with a real confidence, a real authenticity, and that combined, I guess, with natural instincts, gave him a tremendous presence. Rhodes, not dissimilar in that he was an empire man. He believed that the empire would be great for the world, and as a result he had this end game which was very clear to him. Again, he supposedly had great powers of persuasion, and putting in front of a table, he apparently had this mouth which drew you into him. He could, people just watched his mouth and had this sort of the way he spoke, or something about it. So there was certainly some natural instinct there, but I think more than that, these guys had tremendous confidence in what they were trying to do. I'm not saying those were right, their goals, in fact, a lot of them weren't, or most of them weren't, but from a leadership perspective, they had that benefit of knowing exactly where they're going. I guess that's the $1 million question for a lot of people in business and in leadership. What is that goal, especially in a world which is becoming more complex? But all these leaders right through to Mandela, Smuts was the one who probably didn't have as much. It was less clear about where his end goal was, but he also had a presence about him. People, in a sense, knew when he had walked into a room. Obas that was his name because he was a man who held people's attention, and so there's I guess that's something that's got to be built, and
the gravitas.
Yeah, the gravitas. Yeah.
So you mentioned there that President Cyril Ramaphosa is probably pulled in many directions just because of the complexity of the world and the place that he finds himself in. And he's obviously recently just won a South African election and looking to be sworn in imminently. What can he learn from the story that you tell?
Yeah, I think for me, probably the most important thing that comes out of my story, even this was my own learning as I went through this process, is that it is complicated. And complexity is a beautiful thing if you are prepared to acknowledge it, because it allows you to soften your opinions on elements and to spend time thinking and listening. And in a sense, it enables a sense of empathy. But I think understanding that this country is hugely complex is a very good starting point. Building unity in a South African context from a leader is quite a rare thing, and it's a tough thing. It's in a sense, leading in South Africa, I'd imagine it's much easier to look where the seams are least tight and rip them apart, and to then build a political career based on division rather than unity. And very few South African leaders have really pushed the unity mold. But I think with the acknowledgement that it's complex, acknowledging that the people who've arrived here each have a very interesting story to tell, we could try and build our consensus in our past and our current, and try and build unity off the back of that. I mean, that would, I guess, it's sounding more like a dream than an advice. And certainly I know Cyril Ramaphosa is a very bright man and a very well-read man, so I'm hesitant to throw advice. But that would be my take from the past, is that, it's being a great South African leader, one which history will look back on you well, would be the person who looks to unite South Africans rather than to, for political reasons perhaps, create divisions.
Well, I think that's a really wonderful place to put a comma in it. Maybe we have another episode. It was wonderful to spend the hour with you. It's gone so fast.
Yes.
And thank you, Muitheri, for the co-hosting. I think you were, complete natural and brilliant at it.
Oh, thank you.
And we really encourage everyone to go and, watch your show, and certainly on YouTube there's a lot that you can learn, and we're very grateful for the role you're playing in South Africa. I know you minimize it quite a lot, and you have a lot of humility, but every person who comes to watch that show walks away, slightly changed, and one can't underestimate the power.
Absolutely.
No, well, thanks guys, it's been a great pleasure.
Attending my father's court was a profound experience for me. I left both speechless and more meaningfully engaged in my history. I am planning to take my children and highly recommend his show, especially to South Africans. Michael is a South African hero, living his purpose with humility and commitment. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share. Your comments are very important to us. Check out our website, www.omnicor.co.za, for our blog and previous episodes. And a big welcome and thank you to Collis Naidu, our new producer.